I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is Fear and Greed's Sunday feature interview. I'll be back again tomorrow with another weekday episode of Fear and Greed, the normal mix of business news and interviews that sets you up for a successful day. In the meantime, enjoy our Sunday feature interview. At Fear and Greed, we try to highlight great stories of innovation and entrepreneurship, and this morning we're speaking with an expert. Professor Colin McLeod is the Executive Director of the Melbourne Entrepreneurial Centre at the University of Melbourne. Professor McLeod co-founded his first business in 1992, which expanded to a national company with almost 200 employees, and he continues to have an interest in the commercialisation of innovation. Professor Colin McLeod, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Good morning, Sean, and nice to talk to you.
So, Colin, tell me, how do you go from a startup in 1992 to Director of Melbourne Entrepreneurial Centre?
I think, like all these stories, there's a bit of a history to it, but I'll try and give you the shortened version. Around the time that I was involved with the startup that you mentioned in the introduction, I also started doing a PhD, and for various reasons I got interested in the commercialisation of innovation. And basically the underlying idea is that no one can take an innovation to market on their own. The biggest companies in the world can't do it. So how do they sort of form partnerships? And then I had the opportunity to go and work in Silicon Valley, actually at the University of California at Berkeley for a couple of years. So I was sort of doing my PhD, collecting data in Silicon Valley, involved with a business that was going well back in Australia. So that was sort of an introduction to three different parts of entrepreneurship and innovation. If you like, the academic side, my personal experience, but also seeing these other incredibly rapidly growing technology companies in Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. When I came back to Australia, I actually left the university for about 15 years. And I came back to the university in late 2011. And entrepreneurship at the university was getting a bit of momentum. They launched the first accelerator program by any university in Australia. There was some teaching going on around entrepreneurship. And so I just sort of got involved in that community. And I think over time, the university realised it would be good to sort of put all those things under one entity, if you like, which became the Melbourne Entrepreneurial Centre. So I was asked to become the first director of that. I'd also been involved in the launch of a Master of Entrepreneurship degree at the university, the establishment of the Wade Centre for Entrepreneurship at Ormond College. So it was a bit of good timing, I guess, as much as anything else. But the university was also committed to the idea of building, if you like, a physical structure that could house entrepreneurship at the university. So early next year, we're opening a building called Melbourne Connect, which will have, it's really about digital technology and digital futures. So it'll have a number of, unfortunately I can't name who they are, but some very high profile corporate institutions in there. It'll have the university in there. It'll have my entrepreneurial centre in there. So it'll be a place where industry, the university and students can come together. So I guess I've just been fortunate a couple of times. All these different parts of the puzzle have come together, and I've sort of been there at the right time with, I guess, the right skills and experience to be able to play a role.
Now, I'm not totally going to let you get away with that brief version. So what was the business in 1992? What was the startup that you did that became successful?
It was actually in occupational health and safety. So in the new Kent government introduced a whole new set of regulations around occupational health and safety, and particularly around what was then work care, which became work cover. And we saw that there was an opportunity, if you like, for a new approach to taking care of people who got injured at work, whether it was physical injury or emotional injury. So we introduced a new model, and to be, I guess, without sounding immodest, it sort of took the world by storm. Our case costs were much lower. Our outcomes were much better. And I've got to say, that wasn't my doing. That was my wife and our business partner, a woman called Suzanne Burke. And so we grew very, very rapidly. We grew completely organically. I mean, we grew 50% a year for 10 consecutive years. And this is a professional services business. And as you know, they're very hard to scale and very hard to grow.
Yeah, yeah.
So we grew by word of mouth, and we also grew internally by word of mouth. I think we advertised for staff, I think, in about the last time was in the second year of the business, and we then expanded to the sort of numbers you were talking about without ever having to advertise for people, because we were also regarded as a good place to work. It was one of those things that sort of gave you a lot of fulfillment, because injured workers don't often get well looked after by the system, even today, despite all the improvements in that system. And it did feel like you were making a difference to people's lives, but it's also a pretty difficult industry. You're often caught in a a bit of a wedge between employers, insurers, government regulations, and the injured workers. So it sort of takes its toll. And so after 10 years, we decided it was time to get out.
Okay, but what I find interesting in that story, or one of the many things I find interesting in that, is that there was a legislative change that provided the opportunity. In 1992, there was a legislative change that allowed John Simon to create Aussie Home Loans, which effectively allowed low home loans for the next 30 years, and that continues today. Often innovation comes out of those little changes. Would you agree?
Absolutely correct. It's interesting you mention that because I was at Stanford earlier this year, and I was sitting in a class taught by a friend of mine, and the guest presenters were people who were involved in the marijuana industry. And traditionally, medicinal marijuana, marijuana is a food source, but of course, a lot of the American states are going through the legalization of cannabis process. And these guys had raised something like $100 million in venture capital because they were about to enter the legal cannabis, personal consumption market. And they'd actually done a deal with the estate of Bob Marley to be able to market their products under Bob Marley's name. So it was an industry entirely created around legislative change.
I'm talking to Professor Colin McLeod. We'll be back with more in a minute. Professor Colin McLeod is my guest this morning. Okay, so what were you doing your PhD in? Was that anything in this area, or you just ended up morphing into this area?
It was very much in this area. I was particularly interested in deep tech commercialisation. How things got from, if you like, the lab or the computer or the workbench into the community, I suppose. Whether it was social impact or whether it was commercial impact. And the sort of underlying idea was that it didn't matter whether you were one of the largest companies in the world or a backyard inventor. You could never take a product to market on your own. Whether you need someone to build it for you, distribution channels, service support, help desks, and all those sorts of things. And at the time, there was a pretty good realisation, I guess, that some of the typical mechanisms for safeguarding partnerships, like legal systems, the argument was they couldn't keep up with the pace of change. So if you're an inventor and you want to get your product to market quickly, do you just say, look, I'm just going to do this on a shake of a hand and trust people because the legal system won't keep up with me? Or do you take the risk that you can get your legals in place, but you might miss the market opportunity? They were the sort of concerns that I was looking at. And so basically, if you sort of think about a continuum, you can have almost like a watertight contract at one end and a shake of the hand at the other end. And both of them have their risk and reward. So I was trying to look at mechanisms that involve both of those things. And Berkeley was actually a good place to do it because there's a lot of expertise there in behavioural economics, game theory, and a guy called Oliver Williamson, who actually won the Nobel Prize for his work on interfirm economics. I'm not an economist, but I was quite interested in both the psychology, the economics, and the legal structure of these relationships.
Incredible. Now, look, I'm going to take a step back. When I speak to someone like you, I'm always interested in how you actually define innovation and entrepreneurship, if you can.
Sure. I always think about innovation as inventing something that has an application. And so we do see a lot of fundamental research, if you like, at a university, like basic research. So if we don't know how a cell works, it's very difficult to devise cures for different types of cellular diseases, from cancer through to viruses and what have you. So there's, if you like, basic research. But when I think about innovation, I think about inventions that have some potential to be commercialised.
Yeah. And
I'd use commercialised in as broad as possible terms because a lot of inventions have a social impact rather than a commercial impact. And of course, they can have both. So innovation is about, if you like, new ideas and new technology that have an impact out in the world. And entrepreneurship is the process of getting them from where they are today at the invention stage into the hands of people who can use them.
Okay. So, I mean, the innovation and entrepreneurship, both of them are critical to successful business.
I think the evidence on that is pretty overwhelming, really. I mean, I think a lot of your listeners would be familiar with the works of, or the quote from Joseph Schumpeter, the famous Austrian economist back in the 30s, about the winds of creative destruction, which basically means that there's like a cycle of change that happens in every company and in every industry. And you sort of think about new technologies and the rate of adoption of new technologies. And going back to the 30s and 40s and 50s, the time from when a product like a colour television or a radio, even the internet or a microwave oven, the time from when they were launched to when they got 100 million users was measured in years and in some cases decades. These days we measure it in days. People bring out new apps and new technologies that get 100 million users literally in 100 days. And so we're surrounded by a world that's sort of full of change. And if you don't keep up with that change, then you will become part of the creative destruction, and not necessarily in a good way. The other thing I'd say is that if you look at, say, global stock markets, and I'll use the US because that's the one I probably know the best, the average time for a public company to be listed on the stock exchange in the US has halved in the last 25 years. And it's now down to 15 years. So a company listed today, statistically, will last 15 years before it's demised.
Right?
Now,
Wow.
as you know better than me, some delist for a variety of reasons other than the fact that they fall over, but a lot of them do fall over. And I think it's also instructive when you look at if you look at the biggest companies in the world these days globally, you're looking at companies that are literally one generation old, Alphabet or Google, Facebook, Tencent, Amazon, Alibaba. These are, in some cases, companies that didn't even exist 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And yet you think about the way in which, say, Alphabet or Google has changed the face of journalism, which is one that you guys would know better than anyone. Online shopping, telecommunications. I mean, you think about, particularly, I look a lot at sort of Chinese telecommunications, and you think about things like WeChat. People in China live their life through WeChat.
Yeah.
And yet it didn't exist 10 years ago.
It also demonstrates just how good Microsoft and Apple are, because they have been around for 40 or 50 years in a sector which is always being disrupted.
I think they're two really interesting examples. And if I take Apple as an example, some of us are old enough to remember when Apple first started, and their expertise used to be in building stuff. Like they used to make motherboards, and you could go into a computer shop and buy an Apple mouse or an Apple keypad or an Apple computer. You could buy peripherals, you could buy motherboards and what have you. Of course, now Apple don't make anything. If you look at your iPhone, including the software and the hardware, there's maybe 5 to 10% of that actually comes from Apple. The rest of it comes from somewhere else. So what they've become really good at is branding. They've clearly become very good at project management because they've got to coordinate all these different suppliers. So they're very good at outsourcing. And, of course, they're unbelievably good at retailing. Now, if someone had said to you, said to Steve Jobs 30 years ago, do you realise that in 2020 Apple will be one of the most successful retailers in the world? You probably would have looked at it and thought, what are you thinking? But so they're great examples of companies that have sort of ridden the winds of creative destruction, and I guess been part of the creative destruction that's, I guess, sidelined other companies. I mean, you think about when Apple started, the big computer brands like Compaq. You think about companies like Google. I mean, at the time that Google launched, there were probably, 20 or 30 really well-known search engines, many of them owned by people like Hewlett-Packard or Microsoft and what have you. And yet something invented by a couple of PhD students from Stanford became the global gold standard. So we do see that it's almost like if you've got the right innovation and the right entrepreneurship capability, there are no markets closed to you, whereas markets used to be closed just by sheer size. And so we do see things changing quite rapidly, as you say.
Do you ever see arbitrary or at least change that actually goes backwards? And I suppose I'm thinking of Amazon and Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post, a traditional newspaper. Now, I don't know why he did that. Maybe he did it because he actually wanted political power rather than a financial return or whatever. But do you ever see things going back to as they were?
It's interesting because I am someone who buys a newspaper, has it home delivered every day, and I like to see the newspaper physically with my breakfast. But then I go online, I look at the Washington Post, and I look at CNN and all those sorts of things. And it's interesting, sometimes I'll ask a class of students, how many of you bought a newspaper today? None. In the last week? None. Last month? None. How many of you plan to buy a newspaper in the next year? None.
Yeah. I quite seriously, I was getting out of the car with my son, and I said he was going off to school. I said, I'm going to buy a paper and buy a cup of coffee. And he looked at me and he said, have you ever bought a paper? He'd never actually seen me with a paper. Now, he's young, but I thought that was weird. I mean, I worked in newspapers.
My kids span a fair age range. So my youngest is 20. But I said to him one day, how come you never answer your phone?
Yeah.
And he says, well, when I ring, I know it's you. You're the only person who rings me.
Oh, yes.
If I'm doing something, I can call you back later. So when you look at his phone bill, his only phone calls are to his parents.
Yeah.
Everything else is done through social media. It's just extraordinary.
In times like COVID-19 times, and you think of the GFC, global financial crisis, you mentioned the turn of the century earlier on. Are these good times to be innovative, and do more opportunities arise because there is so much disruption and potentially dysfunction in the market?
I'm always a bit sort of guarded in this, but I think that history probably tells us, yes, it is a good time. I think the first thing that, and particularly if you take COVID-19 as an example, people are going to rethink office space. They're going to rethink public transport, their interaction with medical or health service providers, their interaction with their community. Even in the university environment, we've all gone online. It's clearly not the same as doing it face to face, but there are some aspects of online that actually work pretty well that we'll probably continue with. So I do think that we'll see changes that will take place and things that will become sort of institutionalised, whereas we're doing them a bit on the fly at the moment. So I suspect that everyone will be thinking about office space very differently, and do people need to come to the office and all those sorts of things. I think a lot of us have found that because Zoom or equivalents have become such an acceptable protocol, if you like, I've been visiting classes taught by friends at Stanford and Cambridge, which, you can't jump on a plane and go there physically, but they invite you to come along to their classes and speak in their classes and what have you. Now, I wouldn't normally think of inviting a university colleague from another, from an international university just to drop into my classes and have a look around.
Incredible.
But, we're doing those sorts of things. I think the other thing is that I think COVID-19 is a particularly interesting case because, as you know, a lot of people have spoken about it as a black swan event, like something out of the blue, completely unexpected. I was in a phone conversation or a Zoom conversation with Peter Doherty, who's Nobel Prize winner on an expert on viruses and immunology, and he's still works. He's part of the larger University of Melbourne community. And he was saying it was a completely predictable event. We know that coronaviruses live in the wild. It's a matter of when, not if. And I think those sorts of things will help us start thinking, well, we do need to think a bit more about the future. We do need to think more about what we can be doing today that can make, as someone famously said, predictions are hard, especially about the future. But we can think about how we might respond to those changes in the future. So I think, as we think about education, health, financial security, personal security, raising kids and all those sorts of things, I do think this is a time that will stimulate a lot of rethinking and generate a whole lot of new opportunities about a different world going forward.
Those examples you give aren't what you would call technology related. And I think that's really interesting because people often think about innovation and entrepreneurship with the perimeter of technology around it. But really, innovation and entrepreneurship can occur in any aspect of life.
I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, you even think about some of the well-known entrepreneurial organisations. I think someone like Airbnb is a really good example. You've got people with space that they never thought about renting out. You've got people with demand for space who want to go and travel and stay in different types of accommodation. So they built a platform between them. There's nothing special about the platform. There's no, incredible technology driving it. It's simply a different business model that says that holiday house that's always been the worst investment of your life has suddenly become a good one. If you live in the States, once again, better than me, the only worse investment than a holiday house is a car. All of a sudden, your car becomes a money-earning asset. And so, Uber didn't invent cars. They didn't invent passengers. They invented something that goes between them. And there's nothing special about the technology. It's a different business model. And so I think increasingly we're seeing that, innovation is about different business models rather than about technology. Once again, you think about Uber Eats and DoorDash and people like that, people with supply, people with demand, and someone just matching the two together. Now, arguably, you could run DoorDash or Uber Eats or Uber or Airbnb by telephone or by fax for those of us who are a bit older. But technology just makes it more efficient and lower cost, I guess. But it's the business model itself that's the innovation, not the technology.
So is management and or leadership must be a big part of innovation then?
That's a really interesting question because for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is in the early part of an innovation or let's say an entrepreneurship, a new venture, as a founder, you've got to attract people to come and work for you. You've got to attract capital if you need investment. And you've got to attract sort of mentors and advisors and partners and what have you. So you've got to have the ability to create a realistic vision, not some sort of pipe dream, but an articulate, well-founded, evidence-driven vision that is captivating enough for people to want to come on the journey with you. Because often for a founder, that's the main thing is your vision, because you're still working out what your idea is. You might have a piece of technology, but the way to apply it, make it user friendly, and all those sorts of things are still under development. You haven't gone into the market yet, so you're not 100% certain the market actually exists. So most early stage venture capitalists will tell you that the people would be the number one criterion for determining their investment in a new venture. And so you've got to be quite capable of painting a vision. It doesn't mean you've got to be a sort of a hot gospeler or anything like that, or a wonderful salesperson, but you have to have a reasoned, sensible vision with a bit of passion involved. As time goes on and the organisation starts to grow and you have different partners, you start to get people in with more specialist skills, you need to start putting some management in place. So there's a raft of evidence that shows that most new ventures tend to fall over at the growth stage rather than the start stage. And so people don't know how to do budgets. They run out of money. They don't have sort of good HR practices, so they either can't attract staff or keep good staff. They don't really understand marketing, so they don't write marketing plans. And it's interesting because we often think about that formalisation of processes as being sort of the antithesis of entrepreneurship, but in fact, there's really overwhelming evidence that putting those processes in place actually promotes growth and promotes good financial outcomes and good social outcomes. So as the founder entrepreneur, the question that you have is, well, if I need to put these management capabilities in place, do I need to get them? Do I need to go and do some study? Do I need to go and do some short courses? Or do I need to bring them in? And so you get to this stage where you start to think about, well, what's my role in this company? Do I want to continue to be the leader, the visionary, and so on, and hire in people with those other skills, or do I want to take on a more managerial role? And I think the Google example is a really good one. Two brilliant young technologists doing PhDs in computer science at Stanford, and they brought in Eric Schmidt, a very experienced executive, to be their chairman and CEO. They decide, the founders decide they'd continue to be the visionary leaders, but will bring in someone with incredibly good managerial skills to do those other things. So I think the reality is you need both. You need to have both the visionary skills, the leadership skills, and the management skills, but they don't necessarily have to reside in the one person.
I'm talking to Professor Colin McLeod. We'll be back with more in a minute. I'm talking to Professor Colin McLeod, Executive Director of the Melbourne Entrepreneurial Centre at the University of Melbourne. Do you have a favourite entrepreneur or a favourite entrepreneurial company?
Yeah. My students who are listening to this will already know what the answers are. I expect many of them will be laughing. I really love Dropbox as an example. So it's sort of a funny one, but the thing I like about Dropbox is Drew. I've never met Drew Houston, but through various means, I know his lawyers quite well. I should say socially, not through.
Sure.
And I met them a couple of years ago in Silicon Valley, and I asked them the same question. They said Drew Houston. They explained to me why. And basically, Drew Houston was a college graduate from MIT, came from Texas, went to MIT and did computer science. And he had the trouble of carrying, USB sticks around and thought there's got to be a better way and so on. And at the time that he launched Dropbox, there were something like 100 existing file sharing services, like from Napster, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, etc., etc. So he decided that he would focus on the home user, or students, if you like, the personal users, whereas the rest are all focused on large corporate users who need to move big piles of files around. And he tells this great story about it took him 8 weeks to develop the technology. Like 8 weeks from starting to having a file sharing service that worked really well with the appropriate security and what have you in place. It then took him 2 years to make it user friendly because he had no idea what it would be like using this technology for someone who wasn't proficient in technology.
Who hadn't gone to MIT.
Well, that's right. And he talks about sitting in, watching users using Dropbox. And he said, you just felt like jumping over and saying, no, just move the mouse here or click on that icon. He said, you had to sit back. And he talks about the worst day of his life was watching only five people use Dropbox for the first time. He thought, this is just a complete failure. Like, this is just never going to take off. But when he looked at the notes at the end of the day, he'd identified 73 different things that he could do to improve usability. And the reason I like that story is, if you like, an openness to learning, a lack of ego about what he'd invented, and a willingness to engage with customers to understand the problem they're trying to fix from their perspective. He'd had the problem of running around campus with USB sticks and all those sorts of things, but he didn't understand the problem from the perspective of someone who wasn't an expert user. And I just think there's so much in that story for anyone who wants to be an entrepreneur.
What a great place to leave it. Colin, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
No, very happy to do so, Sean. Nice to talk to you.
That was Professor Colin McLeod, Executive Director of the Melbourne Entrepreneurial Centre at the University of Melbourne.